Hello, and welcome everyone to the first episode of the People's Podcast. Today, I am very happy to be joined by a very special guest. It is none other than Chris Hedges, the former reporter for the New York Times, foreign correspondent, Middle East bureau chief, Balkans bureau chief, author of several best-selling books, writes for many publications, and host of the Emmy Award-winning show on RT America, On Contact. It is Chris. And so Chris, you were also the most watched speaker at the People's Convention that we hosted in August. It was fantastic to have you there, and it's great to be catching up with you now.
Great. Thanks, Nick.
Well, everyone, we've started the People's Podcast as a way of communicating to more people, reaching folks on more platforms. And so we are very happy to have this episode as our first. I'm very happy to be launching this platform and to be doing so with such a distinguished and I think incisive guest. I think, Chris, you've emerged as one of the most incisive analysts of our time right now. Of the Biden administration, of the Democrats as a whole. We were talking a little bit before the show about how you've been trying to preach this message for a long time, ever since 2000 and before. I've heard you say before that that you feel that that the left should have left the Democratic Party, in fact, in the 1990s when Clinton betrayed the working class. And finished what George Bush Sr. could not, and passed NAFTA, and that it's been a story of betrayal from the Democrats ever since then. But you turned on the Green New Deal, of course, so many of the things that you've talked about. I wanted to ask you first, because we're amazingly nearing the end of Biden's first 100 days, Biden and Harris's first 100 days. And as I thought about this, and as I thought about our conversation, I compared it to FDR's first 100 days in the wake of what was the Great Depression at the time. And us now being in the midst of what is the greatest economic crisis and also the greatest public health crisis since the Great Depression and since the Spanish-American flu. The comparison between FDR and Biden, which incredibly some liberals were trying to draw, have been trying to draw, even some progressives have tried to draw, but it seems to me like there is no comparison whatsoever. I mean, FDR convened a special session of Congress. He coined the term first 100 days, convened a special session of Congress, ran the national legislature like a New Deal printing press, passing dozens of bills, more than 70, including many major bills that put tens of millions of people to work, employed them, fed them, housed them. And now, as we're almost 80 days into the Biden administration's first 100 days, I wanted to ask you, how would you compare them? How do you see the scale of the response to these two crises and the Democratic Party of today compared to that of the 30s?
There's no comparison, because what Biden has done is refuse to address the structural inequities. He, of course, campaigned on $15 an hour and then walked away from it. He campaigned on checks for $2,000, which is ridiculous to mail a one-time check of $2,000 to families that are overwhelmed by credit card debt, medical debt, behind on their rent payments, unemployed or underemployed. These are really token gestures. If you look at the sum, we don't know the final figure, but 1.9 trillion for the COVID relief bill, the ARP, and then somewhere around 3 trillion, it's not determined yet, for infrastructure spread out over several years. Almost all of this money is going into the hands of large corporations. In terms of the COVID relief bill, it's a windfall of tens of billions of dollars for the for-profit pharmaceutical and insurance industry. In terms of infrastructure projects, again, that money will go either through state offices to large corporations that do infrastructure work. I mean, part of the reason that our infrastructure is in such distress is because it hasn't been maintained with falling tax rates. Even this supposed increase in the tax rate that Biden is proposing is just pushing us back to where it was roughly before Trump cut it. So it's a very different from FDR, who, as you said, put 12 million people to work, created Social Security, lifted the ban on all sorts of labor unions, which empowered the working class. So I worry that by the end of this year, all of that money is going to be gone. Unemployment benefits are extended until July. You have a tax credit for children. The moratorium just gets extended. I think now it's extended till June, but I think it's 20% of renters, if I have that figure right, can't meet their monthly payments. And so now they're waiting on a knife's edge to see whether whether the moratorium will be extended beyond June. And if it won't, we're talking about millions, probably tens of millions of families being evicted from their homes. So yes, it's extremely disappointing. And what's even more disappointing is the kind of gushing embrace of, this is somehow radical change on the part of the press. David Brooks is writing columns lauding all of this. But it doesn't structurally change anything. And by the end of the year, everybody's going to be back where they are. And that's very dangerous, because it is exactly that disenfranchisement, that dislocation, that abandonment of the working class that gave rise to the phenomena of Trump. Trump didn't create it. Trump catered to it. It was there long before Trump arrived. I think you found it expressed through the Christian right. I wrote a book on the Christian right, American Fascists, the Christian right in the war in America. I did not use the word fascist lightly, but all of this kind of magical thinking, white supremacy, rampant militarism, homophobia, all of that was embodied in the Christian right that Trump tapped into, and that's still there. In fact, it's going to be worse, and I fear that the legacy of the Biden administration is that it delivers to us a competent demagogue instead of an incompetent one.
And you referenced the role of the media and the way that the media has been treating Biden. I've never in my life, Chris, seen a level of propaganda around a Democratic president or a president in propping him up that I've seen around Biden. I mean, the effort to portray him as this kind of like, reforming, emerging after decades of service, to almost a half a century of service to Wall Street, to the military-industrial complex, to now portray him as this like born-again progressive figure because he's raising corporate taxes from 21% to 28% when Trump lowered it from 35%. So he's taking it half of the way back up. And I just read this morning from the New York Times to get their daily newsletter, this kind of incredible portrayal. There's just no context. It's completely detached from that. It's treated as if Biden is raising corporate tax rates. Of course, the fact that he is putting children back in detention centers at the border is basically not discussed again, or if it is, it's just completely apologized for. I just read today as well that Biden, who came into office preaching Black Lives Matter, preaching racial equality, against white supremacy, systemic racism, and who kind of cloaked himself in the Black Lives Matter movement and the movements of the summer, that he is actually arming police in the United States with a greater degree and value of weaponry, military weaponry, than even Trump was. And so I wonder, just what would you say about that and the role of the media as a society descends in the way that it is today into authoritarianism?
Well, I would say the media was pretty bad under Obama, too. I mean, nobody looked at Obama's policies. They looked at the fact that he was a person of color and young and charismatic, and kind of ignored what his policies were, which were as bad or worse than Biden's. Obama's assault on civil liberties actually outdid those of George W. Bush. He immediately, as soon as he took office, catered to Wall Street instead of the victims that had suffered under fraud from these large financial firms and banks. I mean, that's part of the bankruptcy of the media. It's all about image as opposed to substance. I think that failure on the part of the media to report accurately and honestly has preceded the Biden administration, although you're perfectly right that the reporting has been appalling. Biden was one of the primary architects of that Democratic decision led by Clinton to transform the Democratic Party into the Republican Party and essentially push the Republican Party so far to the right it became insane. That was all Biden. The Omnibus Crime Bill, he was a major author of the Patriot Act. The Omnibus Crime Bill vastly expanded our prison population, militarized our police. Biden bragged about it at the time. I think he increased the number of federal crimes that merited the death penalty from a handful, 1 or 2, to 50. He used to go, I think, 51. He used to walk around and bragging about it. Under Clinton, they were responsible for doubling and tripling sentences. So you have 40%. We have 25% of the world's prison population. We're 4.4% of the world's population. 40% of the people in our prison population have never been charged with physically harming another person. We have people serving life sentences for drugs. That was all Biden. And of course, the militarization of the police was all Biden. And I think that's part of the problem with the liberal class is that they don't have any real contact, or they don't have relationships with people who have suffered from these kinds of policies. I teach in a prison. Half of my students wouldn't be in that classroom but for Biden and Clinton. And I don't know how, and not only have they suffered horrendous injustice, but so has their families, their children. I don't know how you could walk out of a prison classroom and then turn around and vote for Biden or support Biden. But I think that there's, for so much of the liberal elite, the suffering in this country is very real, not only among communities of color, but among the white working class. And much of my family comes from the white working class in Maine. That's all real. And to write these people off either as super predators if they're black or as deplorables if they're white just shows how bankrupt the liberal elite itself is. And of course, that is, I think, portrayed in the kind of echo chamber that has built up around Biden, as you correctly point out, lauding what are very meager crumbs really tossed to working men and women, while once again Wall Street and large corporations swallow staggering sums of money. This is just a playbook that we've seen going back to 2008, and that's what Biden's continued. But it's a very dangerous route, and it's one that's going to, I think, has potential political consequences that are very grave for the country.
We completely agree, because the pandemic, it appears, has been used by elites, by corporations, by both parties to accelerate the decline of the country, to accelerate massive levels of wealth inequality. I mean, the billionaires have taken more than $1 trillion now from the working class, at the same time that, as you described earlier, there are tens of millions of people who will literally lose their homes in the United States the minute that these moratoriums are stopped being rolled over. That's literal, that they're never going to be able to pay that debt. I mean, in the United States, in other countries, it's amazing. In other countries, they're providing either basic incomes, they kept their employees on payroll. The government subsidized companies to keep their employees on payroll. So they understood the basic equation that if you want people to survive and to continue being able to purchase in the economy, to be able to buy food, housing, basic needs, you need to maintain some kind of income. If you're going to lock down the economy and you're going to prevent them from going to their jobs, then you have to continue to provide for them in some way. And here in the United States, we're at a point where these two parties are so unbelievably corrupt and so unbelievably determined just to destroy kind of whatever remains of a middle class in this country, that they instead didn't square that basic equation, thinking somehow 80% of people before the pandemic are living paycheck to paycheck. Half the country can't afford a $500 emergency. And so what are we going to do? What's going to happen? We're going to cut off everybody's, jobs, 50 million unemployment claims in the wake of the pandemic, which we've never recovered from, of course. All of this debt that people have picked up, not just from housing, but medical debt, also student debt, more than $1 trillion in student debt. And that's never going to be paid. And that is just like a reinvention of a form of bondage against people. And so one of the things, though, that was hopeful kind of following this election, maybe a glimmer of hope, was that, and something else I wanted to ask you about, was that there was the potential of possibly doing something about this now that hadn't existed before. Because as a result of the Democrats' utter corruption and incompetence, they actually lost seats in the House of Representatives and came down to a margin of about only 4 votes. And so as Ilhan Omar pointed out back in December, it only takes 5 courageous progressives, of which there are supposed to be 100 in the CPC. There's a squad is supposed to be 6. There's plus many others like Pramila Jayapal, Ro Khanna. And so that margin is supposed to allow them to act as a bloc and exercise power as you're supposed to do. So just like Joe Manchin has his 1 vote and he can deny the 50 votes in the Senate, Bernie Sanders has 1 vote in the Senate. The squad has enough votes to deny a majority for the Democrats in the House. And yet it seems like opportunity after opportunity comes along where they have the ability to exercise power in a way to win substantive, meaningful structural changes to the conditions that the working class has in this country. The $15 minimum wage, Medicare for all with the force the vote push. And yet they don't seem to be taking any of these opportunities. In fact, I even took note of the fact that Pramila Jayapal and the progressives moved the introduction of Medicare for all in the House, which was just recently introduced. They moved the introduction from February over to March after the introduction of the American Rescue Plan, after the stimulus package. Why would you do that as a progressive? It's incomprehensible. If you could gain so much leverage, you have the moderates on one hand demanding things like Joe Manchin saying we want unemployment to go from 400 to 300. We don't want the $15 minimum wage. Cut that. We don't want a public option. Cut that, which Biden ran on. We don't want to include student debt forgiveness. Cut that. And so if the moderates in the party are allowed to make all this demands, and yet the progressives have enough of a foothold because of such razor thin margins right now that they could, on the other hand, make other demands, rather than accepting that, rather than accepting 400 to 300 for unemployment benefits, which is a lifeline for millions of people in this country, they could come out and demand instead, no, it's going to go to 600. Or in fact, we're going to get a $2,000 a month basic income, and it's going to be retroactive to the beginning of the pandemic, when you gave literally trillions of dollars to Wall Street within 2 weeks of the beginnings of the lockdown, showing your priorities. And so what I wanted to ask you, Chris, is what is holding them back from acting on that power?
Well, they don't want to lose their political position, same thing that holds Bernie Sanders back. And this has long characterized Bernie's relationship with the Democratic Party. Remember, Sanders was campaigning for Clinton in '96 after NAFTA, after the omnibus crime bill. And the same with AOC and the Squad. And they're not wrong. I mean, Pelosi and Schumer and the Democratic Party establishment would crush them if they actually defied them. And so they're not going to defy them. They'll tweet garbage out and, make, appropriate kind of noises. But they're not going to do anything of substance because they are well aware that their political career would be over and they're not going to risk it. So they're careerists. And I guess they assume it's better them than someone else, but it's made them utterly ineffectual as a political force, as you correctly pointed out. So you're right. They do have a certain amount of power at the moment, but they won't use it because they realize that the Democratic Party machine would destroy them. That's why. That's why Bernie never takes on the Democrats. It's why Bernie, I was in Philadelphia. Cornel West and I were with several thousand homeless people outside the appropriately named Wells Fargo Center on the night that Bernie endorsed Clinton. And hundreds of people walked out, his supporters walked out, and he should have walked out with them. He didn't. He missed his historical moment. And he didn't walk out. Well, in fact, Bernie let the Clinton campaign take over his Twitter account to essentially send out messages to all his delegates and supporters to support Clinton. And because he knew that he'd lose his Senate seat and he'd be tossed into the political wilderness like Ralph Nader, or go back to George McGovern, who also defied the Democratic Party establishment. And after the Democratic Party elite allied itself with the Republican Party elite to destroy him in the presidential race, they took away his Senate seat. And he was gone. So they know, very, very well the price they would pay for that kind of defiance. They don't want to pay it, and that's the problem.
I agree. It is the party structure, I believe, that holds them back and keeps them from insisting on any kind of change that they run on. It certainly seems like they are more afraid of the party and the party's ability to deny them re-election than they are accountable to the movement. And that's a big problem. And I think it's a big problem as well when it comes to the organizations that have kind of sprung up to support progressive Democrats, particularly in the wake of 2016. And so I was the national political outreach coordinator on the Bernie 2016 campaign. I helped start Our Revolution after that as its electoral manager. And I saw after the Bernie 2016 campaign, the way that Bernie inspired millions of people to try to go into the Democratic Party, to try to change it, inspired the kind of rise of a new generation of progressive organizations, Our Revolution, Brand New Congress, Justice Democrats, DSA, which grew tremendously in the wake of 2016. But it seems that these organizations are having a fundamental problem of attempting, when it comes to actually keeping these progressives that they've elected, even the few, to begin with, the Democratic Party has just blocked the vast majority of people that those organizations have attempted to run. And so there's still only kind of a small handful of progressives in Congress. That's probably a generous interpretation. But of the ones that are there, I think there's an even deeper problem that has become apparent that some of these organizations don't want to deal with, and that some progressive Democrats don't want to deal with. And that is the question of accountability. How do you actually hold the members of Congress who you have elected, the politicians who you have elected to the Democratic Party, accountable? Because it's become clear that once they get there, there is a machinery within the Democratic Party that begins to act on them. There are all kinds of different forms that the party has levers of control, whether it's threats of primaries, massive pressure to support blue dog Democratic incumbents, and help protect their seats, to protect majorities in the legislature. We recently saw AOC, for example. She recently gave thousands of dollars to establishment Democrats who are actually fighting against Medicare for all. only 2 years after being there and saying that these are the exact same people who we were going to primary in mass. She's now contributing to their campaigns to help shore up their positions. Committee assignments, which we've seen Pelosi and the corporate Democrats actually take away from AOC and take away from other progressives as a way of punishing them and disciplining them. And so, I kind of want to ask you about that dynamic, that when it comes to these organizations, it doesn't seem to be a problem that they had anticipated, but I want to see what you think about that.
Well, it really comes down to whether the Democratic Party is a reformable organization, number one, or whether it's even at its core democratic, and it's neither. And this has just been a misread on the part of progressives. But of course, that misread is perpetrated by the Democratic Party establishment, whether they allow Kucinich to run or Bernie or anyone else. The idea is to give expression to those kinds of issues. But then in the end, once the presidential nominee is selected or anointed, as Biden was, to corral the progressive wing of the Democratic Party or progressives back into the Democratic Party fold. And of course, it works every time, because as the political situation devolves, the monstrosities that are coughed up, whether it's Bush or Trump, become worse and worse. And believe me, this next time around is going to be much worse than Trump. So it's diminishing returns. These figures are careerists in the end. They AOC and Bernie and all the rest of them. They're not temperamentally or morally fit to lead this fight, which is a fight against the ruling elites, which includes the Democratic Party establishment itself. And that is not going to come from within.
Right. One of the points that we've made, Chris, that I want to get your take on is that, there's the questions about the progressives who are in the Democratic Party, particularly AOC, with some of the recent things she's done. Like, for example, the first interview that she gave with DSA, their publication, Democratic Left, she was asked about critics of Biden, the left's critics of Biden, Bernie supporting critics of Biden. And her answer was that those individuals are privileged and that they're making their commentary in bad faith. And that was kind of astonishing. And so I wonder, the analysis that we've had is not so much on the individual level, but rather on the systemic level, that it doesn't matter who you send into the Democratic Party. And this seems to be something that's missing from the progressive movement and the left. It's still a lesson that we need to learn to a large degree. It's not a question of sending individuals with more integrity into the Democratic Party. It is just kind of a basic acceptance of the sociology of what happens to an individual when they're sent into that party and the systemic forces that act on them. And so the way that we view it is less kind of on an individual level, stating that, we just sent the wrong people in. If we send another batch of people in, they'll be better and they'll have more integrity, and it's going to be they're going to make all the right decisions. They're going to challenge Pelosi. They're going to stick up for the $15 minimum wage. They're going to demand even more. That's not the view that we have, and I wonder if you think that's correct to see the party through that systemic lens.
Yeah, I mean, they're powerless within the organization, and they can either play the game, which they're doing, and retain their elected position. And if they don't play the game, they're finished, like Cynthia McKinney and a few others. Ralph back in 2000, and nobody understands corporate power and how it has seized all of the mechanisms of control better than Ralph Nader, nor has, in my mind, anyone been fighting corporate power with more integrity and success than Ralph Nader. And Ralph said, at this point, the only mechanism we have left is to pull 5, 10, 15 million people out of the Democratic Party into a third-party movement to create pressure on the Democratic Party to respond. Politics is a game of fear. And the public relations apparatus is quite sophisticated. All sorts of progressives say all the right things, and then every election cycle get completely weak-kneed and fall down and tell you to vote for Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or whoever. And so, the swamp just gets bigger and wider and deeper. We have to step out. And of course, that initial effort is very lonely. I mean, Ralph never thought he would win. He knew he wouldn't win. That was never the purpose. The purpose was to begin to create a voting bloc that would frighten the Democratic Party and the ruling elites into responding. And of course, that's why they turned Ralph into a pariah.
And I'm glad you bring that up because, of course, that, you point out that success of building an independent party comes in multiple different fashions, that there's multiple different forms of success of, for example, what we're doing is building the People's Party, that by doing that, we can either frighten the Democrats and the elite into making concessions, or we can outright replace them if they won't change, or we can, I would add to that, discover that that in this country, electoral politics is so incredibly manipulated and controlled that it isn't even an avenue for change. And I think that that is a large part of the importance of the work that we're doing at the Movement for a People's Party and building the People's Party. We're now, we've registered in 5 different states, in California, in Maine, in Colorado, in Ohio, in Oregon. And we are building, we're building that right now. And we're preparing to run candidates, about a dozen candidates for Congress, perhaps a candidate or 2 for Senate, and challenge these establishment Democrats and Republicans. And actually, I think it's no coincidence now that we have begun to talk more publicly about, we're not just, we're not just doing this for show. We are actually planning challenges now and logistically beginning to lay that out. I think that the Democrats, I think it's no coincidence that we've seen a reaction from the Democratic Party that is beginning to attempt to attack our efforts to get ballot access. And so that is in Nevada, for example. Just a week ago, State Senator Roberta Lang introduced a measure that would double the number of signatures required to get ballot access in Nevada. There's efforts like this happening in about 4 or 5 different states. Nationally, within H.R. 1, the Democrats, who are of course the champions of that, have slipped in measures that would put even more money into politics and empower the DNC and the RNC with, for example, lift the cap that the DNC and the RNC can give to a presidential candidate from $5,000 to $100 million, and other measures to try to centralize power in their national committees and also to try to block independent parties. And so I think it's no coincidence that that's happened. In fact, the top ballot access expert in the country, Richard Winger, has contacted us and he's advised us on ballot access and said that, yes, I believe that you are responsible for initiating this latest spate of voter suppression. And that's really what it is. And that's what I find most incredible and most revealing about the Democratic Party. That at the same time that the Democratic Party has been throwing its hands up in righteous indignation over Republican voter suppression bills in Georgia and Texas, restricting the voting rights of people of color, the poor, they have been engaging in their own voter suppression campaign against us, the same party that claims to believe in enfranchisement for people of color and the poor. And I find that so revealing about the Democratic Party's principles at a core that, in fact, they are no more guided and led by principle when it comes to voter enfranchisement than the Republicans. It's just a pure calculation of what is in the benefit of their party. That's it.
Yeah, well, that's not new. I mean, voter suppression has dogged the Green Party and Ralph since 2000 and probably before. The two parties collaborated to take control of the debate commission because they didn't want to put Ralph initially. They didn't want to put Ralph on the debate stage, and I understand who would want to have to debate Ralph Nader. They challenged all of or most, I think all of Ralph's voter lists, even though they were legitimate, just to run up his legal costs. I think by the end, he had over $1 million in legal costs. Because money determines access, Ralph could pull 10,000 people in Madison Square Garden, which he did. People actually, he didn't know he was going to be able to afford the rent. He just charged people at the door. I think it was $5 or something, but he filled it and they paid for it. But $10,000 is nothing when you have no access to national media and the potential to reach millions of people. So there are all sorts of mechanisms that both parties use to thwart third-party candidates or even progressives within the Democratic Party. So, for instance, with Dennis Kucinich, if you go back and look at that campaign during the primary, they kept changing the rules to make sure Dennis wouldn't be part of the debates in the Democratic primaries. And most of those debates were actually sponsored, because the debates were sponsored by corporations, were sponsored by the for-profit healthcare industry. And Dennis was for single payer, and they succeeded. He was never going to have a voice. I mean, even in New Hampshire, when he qualified under their own rules, because people dropped out, they locked him out of the building. So there are a series of mechanisms that the both parties, including the Democratic Party, have set up to make it impossible to hear the voices, especially on, for instance, on universal health care or single payer, because the system we have is utterly irrational. It's the most expensive, least efficient system, although it makes staggering profits. I mean, one of the things about the ARP is that we're going to hand billions of dollars to the insurance and pharmaceutical corporations, tens of billions, and they're already making record profits. Again, it's this the whole pandemic, I think, is a window into how our misery is accompanied by the excesses of the 1%. I mean, 84% of stocks in America are held by just 10% of the population. And they're borrowing all sorts of money at virtually 0% interest. They're not investing it. They're giving themselves lavish bonuses and the stock prices by raising the stock. Of course, compensation is tied to stock. The system now at this point, politically, legally, the media, of course, is controlled by corporate entities. The whole system is just geared towards this kleptocracy on the part of the billionaire class, and this is just one piece of it. The electoral system is just one piece of it.
Right. And Chris, you talk often about what you believe could happen or will happen as a reaction to full Democratic Party rule. I completely agree with you that the kind of reaction is going to be a kind of backlash, the kind of backlash that we saw in 2016, except far more intense. Because what I see in this country is a people who are running around seeking some kind, like in a burning building, trapped in a burning building by these two corporate parties, by this corporate elite. And they are running, trying door after door after door to get out of this. And the more they exhaust the doors that appear to be in the mainstream, or that appear to be somewhat in the mainstream, try Obama. Okay, Obama said a lot of the right things, but what happened? He let the bankers off. He did, he governed as a conservative. And so then Trump is this counter reaction to that. Well, Biden, the person, who we have now, our president now, was picked by Obama as his running mate as a signal to Wall Street of the administration's allegiance. And he's governing at a time in which working people are far worse off than they were when Obama took office, even as a result of this recession following the pandemic and of years of stagnant wages right through Obama's term. And so it seems like the backlash is going to be even worse. Than it's going to make Obama to Trump look tame.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that we're going to get, instead of a goofy, narcissistic megalomaniac, who has the attention span of a 3-year-old, we're going to get somebody who's competent. So when they attempt to orchestrate a coup d'etat, which Trump clearly wanted to do, he just didn't have the organizational ability to do it, it's going to work. And we're already seeing that in Georgia, by the way. So I don't know who it's going to be. Mike Pompeo wants to run, Tom Cotton, and maybe somebody we don't know. But that's where we're headed. And it is, of course, the failure on the part of the ruling elites, and the ARP and the infrastructure bill are just, one more example of that. The failure to address the systemic issues that have thrown half the country into poverty or near poverty and misery, and extinguished all hope and devastated communities. And there's going to be a terrible, terrible price to pay for this. Biden was picked. Look, I mean, the ruling elites made it very clear. Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, said that if Bernie Sanders was the nominee, he was going to vote for Trump. That was never going to happen. But the hierarchy, or the donor class of the Democratic Party, was quite public about the fact that they would vote for Trump if Sanders, or even Warren, but in particular Sanders, was the nominee. And so this whole mantra of the least worst, that's only for you and me, and not for them. They didn't like Trump. He was an embarrassment to the empire. And they wanted Biden because he would bring back the kind of decorum and gravitas and change nothing, in essence, which is, of course, what has happened. But that doesn't address the deep malaise and anomie and dislocation and rage, legitimate rage, I would argue, that has enveloped most of the country. And by not addressing that, especially at a time of such economic distress, then the blowback is, I think it's going to be very frightening. It's probably going to come wrapped in a kind of Christian fascism. Remember, Trump had no ideology, but the Christian right filled that ideological void. That was Pence, Pompeo, Betsy DeVos, Ben Carson, and others. And I think we're going to see the Christian right, which I look at it as heretical. I graduated from seminary. I come out of the church. My father was a minister. I'm not unchurched. I look at this as a heretical movement that has sacralized the worst elements of white supremacy and corporate capitalism and American imperialism, much in the same way the so-called German Christian church did under the Nazis. So you have a kind of ideological formation, and someone will probably rise out of that ideological crypto-fascist movement. I mean, that's what I suspect.
And I wonder if you could talk more about what you think that would look like, and what kinds of changes such a person would usher into the country and into the empire.
Well, any pretense of democracy would be gone. I mean, one of the things I find frightening is that Biden is just ruling by decree. This was tried, by the way, in the dysfunctional Weimar government in the lead up to the Nazis. So Ebert and the Social Democrats, when they had a kind of negative majority in the Reichstag between the communists and the fascists, so they just ruled by decree. But it set a kind of precedent, and it means that if you get a figure like Trump or Pompeo or someone else in the office, just instantly everything is overturned because the legislative system doesn't work. That's a very dangerous way to govern. And so all of these executive orders, which are really a misuse of executive power, everything can be instantly reversed, and will be. So I expect all of the kinds of uh, uh, assaults against democratic institutions to be ratcheted up. Certainly, we have seen Silicon Valley work as a censor on behalf of the Democratic Party. They've removed, of course, Trump from social media. They locked the New York Post out of its own Twitter account when it published the information that was found on Hunter Biden's discarded laptop. But you'll get a raw kind of censorship, a raw kind of abuse of military power, a complete bypassing of the judiciary, and a real war against all forms of dissent. But let's be clear, the Democratic Party is also making a war against people like myself who are critics of imperialism and critics of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism as an ideology has no credibility across the political spectrum. And so critics are more dangerous and therefore pushed further and further to the sidelines. So we see, people like Matt Taibbi or Glenn Greenwald who write on Substack. We hear calls now for Substack to be shut down. I've already been hit with all sorts of algorithms that steer people away from my content. That's not conjecture. When I was at TruthDig before it was shut down, we all demanded a union, went on strike, and we were all fired. But the impression, so if you had gone into Google and typed in imperialism, and I'd written a column on imperialism recently, would come up with anything else that was recent about that topic. So the referrals by impressions over a 12-month period dropped from over 700,000 to below 200,000, and they're probably less than that now. So there's a really active campaign on the Democratic Party right as we speak to essentially silence its critics, particularly on the left. Remember, WikiLeaks was the first real victim of this. It wasn't Trump who was removed from social media first. It was Julian Assange's PayPal account. All his credit cards were frozen. You couldn't donate. You got electronic interference when you tried to attend a WikiLeaks event. So I see all of these dystopian measures, which are already with us, just becoming more and more pronounced, and the state becoming essentially more nakedly authoritarian.
There was a comment recently that struck me just as that. Kamala Harris recently made a comment about how we have fought wars for oil. We fought wars for oil, and in the future we'll be fighting wars for water. And it struck me because I thought, wait a minute, so now we're openly admitting that we fought those wars for oil, for decades ago. I remember Trump did that, and and he was chastised by the liberal media for doing that when he did it. You're not supposed to say that. That's the quiet part. You're not supposed to say it out loud. And now it's just it was accepted.
Yeah, I think that one of the results of the Trump administration is that it kind of removed the mask and exposed the ugliness of the American empire. And really, that's how you have to look at Biden. Biden is a desperate attempt on the part of the ruling elites to put the mask back on. I don't think it's going to work. Biden comes back and said, we're back. We're back to lead the world or sit at the head of the table, I think was his exact expression. But the fact is the world isn't waiting for us. So, we're becoming as much of a pariah nation as Israel. On all sorts of levels. We can't handle the COVID crisis. The pandemic, I think, has exposed the internal rot and decay within the country, the mass shootings that are at also an epidemic kind of level. There's just so much that's so publicly wrong with this country throughout the world. And perhaps the people who see it least are the Americans who live in the midst of it. But the rest of the world sees it.
The rest of the world is horrified.
Yeah.
And they pay the price, of course. They pay a price just as we do for what happens in this country. Well, I wanted to ask you, Chris, kind of as a closing question, what impact do you think that a new party can have, that the efforts that we're working on can have, and in what ways can it succeed? In what ways do you think that we should proceed about it? In what ways do you think that what does a new party have to do to be successful?
Well, I was intimately involved with all of the mechanisms used to shut down Ralph. I mean, as soon as Ralph posed a legitimate threat after 2000 of the Democratic Party, the public vilification and character assassination was intense. I mean, even now progressives will, say to you, well, he gave us Bush, which is ridiculous. I mean, just factually incorrect.
Right.
It stopped the counting after 2 counties, sent it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, overturning all legal precedent, appointed Bush president by judicial fiat. It had nothing to do with Ralph. The campaign run by Al Gore was so tepid he couldn't even carry his home state of Tennessee. So, but that relentless kind of mantra that is trumpeted throughout the corporate media is very effective. I just don't think there's any other route. What is our chances of success? Well, probably not very high, but I just don't see any other way. And I think that the tragedy is that when the working class was betrayed, as you mentioned at the beginning, by the Democratic Party, those of us who care about working men and women didn't challenge the Democratic Party establishment, but exposed ourselves as standing for nothing. And that really deeply destroyed the liberal and progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the liberal progressive movement, because it proved that we were spineless and worthless. And that if we had stood fiercely against the Democratic Party establishment and stood with working men and women, we wouldn't be where we are today. But unfortunately, we didn't do that. So I think, if the left and the liberal elites and progressives don't take a firm stance on behalf of working men and women, then those working men and women, in particular the white working class, which of course is the majority, will show their displeasure with the ruling class by embracing a kind of crypto-fascism. We just have lost that kind of moral imperative that there are things you can't do and things you can't say. The Democratic Party can say or do anything, and we follow along like with a ring through our nose, and now we're going to pay for it. So I think it's very important that we build third-party movements and we challenge and we stand fast for these moral imperatives. But I was Ralph's speechwriter, having worked with Ralph, I also know how vicious the establishment is, especially if they perceive you as a threat.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's only going to ramp up as we are getting into running candidates, and it's going to become less abstract to them. We're already seeing it with those challenges at the national and the state levels, attempt to make our ballot access more difficult. And so, absolutely, I think those attacks are going to ramp up when there are individual Democrats and Republicans who are facing losing their seat to a major new party that is corporate free, or our movement to build one.
Well, you can see it with what they're doing with Shamasawa now.
Yes, the
socialist city councilwoman. I mean, there's a huge campaign right now against her because she has been effective on a local level. I think we've got to get out there and fight this battle. I think it's important, but I think we can't be naive about how ruthless the ruling elites will be the moment we get some traction.
Right. Well, Chris, on that note, on that positive note, uplifting note, it's great to talk to you. It's great to have, I think, your wisdom and your guidance as a movement, and your experience having seen the devolution in other countries. You speak with that, and I think that's very valuable for our movement to hear that and to know that, what exactly we're facing. And so, Chris, I want to thank you for joining us for this episode and for the inaugural episode. And I'll talk to you soon.
Great, Nick. Thanks.
All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.